And welcome back to another episode of the Real Conversations podcast. I'm your host, Jacob O'Connor. Real Conversations is a podcast for those dedicated to doing hard things and living a meaningful life. Today, I'm joined by Tom Gentile. And Tom, I don't usually do this. I don't usually have an introduction for guests. I don't usually have a pre-planned introduction for guests. But you've done so many things that I wanted to make sure that I properly had them listed in a concise manner. So Here we go. Tom Gentile is the CEO and president of Hexel Corporation. Most recently, Tom was president and CEO at Spirit Aerosystems, where he led a team of 20,000 employees globally. Before joining Spirit, Tom was president and chief operating officer at GE Capital, where he oversaw 15,000 direct staff and a $2.5 billion budget. Before joining GE in December, Tom was vice president of strategic planning at CBS Corporation in New York. He is the former chair of the Aerospace Industries Association and serves on the advisory board to the Smithsonian National Air and Space Museum. Tom has a degree in economics from Harvard and an MBA from Harvard Business School, and he also studied international relations at the London School of Economics. Tom, that is quite the resume there.
Oh, well, thank you very much, Jacob. It's great to be here today. I'm looking forward to the discussion.
I am too. This is an exciting episode, and one of my favorite things to do is like you see the outcome, kind of where you ended up, the things you're doing now, and you can read the resume and hear all those cool things. But like if you were to chart the success you've had on a graph and look back at it, each event had to happen independently for the next one to occur. I would love to hear kind of your perspective on what was it like growing up? Was there any indication that your life was going to be on this trajectory or any early signs of success that may come?
Well, I would say that the success that comes or doesn't come, there's a lot of different twists and turns in the road for how you get there, how anybody gets there. And I still have probably more twists and turns to come. But I would say I grew up in Detroit and lived in the city for the first 5 or 6 years of my life. And then we moved out of the city in the late 1960s to a suburb of Detroit. And that's where I went to school. And growing up, my father was in the medical profession. He was a director of medical education. And I had always aspired to be a doctor. And that was something that I thought about. But I was a teenager, probably 14 or 15, and I was in the car with my father, and we heard an advertisement on the radio for Wharton School of Business. And that was my first exposure to business school. And my father told me a little bit about it, and I thought, wow, that sounds really exciting. I would like to go to business school. And so I kind of shifted gears at that time and started thinking about business school. So when I went off to college, I majored in economics and got an internship, and then started at General Motors for the summer of 1985, as it turns out, and then went to work at General Motors afterwards, but with the intention that I was going to go to business school. And so that's how I set my trajectory. And I ended up, after graduation from college, working for 2 years at General Motors and then going back to business school. And then from there, I went into consulting at McKinsey, because it seemed to offer at that time the best opportunity to continue to push on my professional development. Mm-hmm. I always looked at McKinsey as a bit of a graduate school to learn about how to do business and how to make an impact on an organization. And it played out just fine.
So you hear an advertisement from the Wharton School of Business and you decide, okay, I want to go get my MBA. You can get your MBA from any school, but the fact that you made it into Harvard in the first place, I mean, the acceptance rates are absurdly low. What did it take? How did you manage to get into Harvard in the first place?
Well, so going back to Harvard College, so I was in high school and it was the junior year summer, and my father invited me to his boss's house for a lunch in August. And his boss was a doctor at a hospital called Providence Hospital, which is now part of Ascension Health in Detroit, Michigan. And we were talking at breakfast with his boss, a guy named Dr. Ronaldo. And he said, what are you going to do? We're going to go to school next year. I said, well, I'll apply to Michigan and Notre Dame and I'll see which one I get into. And he goes, well, have you ever thought of Harvard? And I said, well, no, I never even crossed my mind. Why would I think of Harvard? He goes, well, I went to Harvard. And he said, I think you would fit in just fine there. He goes, you should apply. And so that's how I got the idea. And I applied to Harvard. And I had good grades and a lot of activities in high school. And I got in. And so that was how I got into Harvard, was just really on a whim by talking to Dr. Ronaldo. And so then coming out of Harvard, I had a lot of friends who were really focused on how to build a career, and they were also thinking about business school. And as I left Harvard College and I had to think about my next career option, there was things like consulting and investment banking, and back then technology didn't exist. So that was not an option. But a lot of the kids were going into consulting and investment banking. And I just said, well, that's really competitive. That's a hard road to go. It might be better if I did something a little bit more unusual. And so going back to Detroit and working for General Motors in the manufacturing industry was something different. And I think that probably distinguished me a little bit because my background was different from all of the other people who were applying from consulting firms and investment banking. I was applying from a Midwest manufacturing company, automotive, and I was doing something a little bit unique in General Motors. It was called countertrade. And so that was also something that was a little bit different. So I think those things maybe gave me a little bit of a different profile, and for some reason they accepted me.
So the early aim was to go get your MBA from Harvard. And did you have an idea, like after you said you want to be a doctor and then the aim was I want to get my MBA, was there anything specifically in the business world that you had your eyes set on? Or was it just, how do I distinguish myself on the resume? Oh, I'm going to go work in Detroit for General Motors, and that's going to help me towards my MBA, and then I'll figure it out as I'm getting my MBA.
There was a thread, and it was international, and thinking about multinational corporations. But when I was a freshman in college, and I decided to major in economics, I decided to specialize in international economics because I was very interested in the international economy and multinational corporations, and that's in my mind what I wanted to do. So when I was a sophomore, I started to take all my international economics classes. And the way that back then, if you took a lot of AP classes in high school, you could start off as a sophomore. They called it sophomore standing.
Yep.
And I had done that, but I didn't want to graduate in 3 years. And so I said, well, what I should do is maybe go abroad. And this was not something that was done in the mid-'80s. It wasn't very big. Now it is much more common. But I applied to the London School of Economics because I thought I can supplement my international economics studies with international relations from the London School of Economics, and that would be a really interesting thing to do. So that's what I did. And it was actually when I was in London that I met the person from General Motors that I did the internship with, and he was working on countertrade, which was how to generate foreign exchange in different countries, mostly in the Eastern Bloc and in Central America, that had currency shortages in Africa. And then you use those dollars to buy goods. So it was heavily used in military, so military offsets, but it was also used a lot in places like Africa and Southeast Asia and Latin America to generate foreign exchange to buy goods from core General Motors or Opel or any of the other overseas subsidiaries. And so that fit into this international focus that I always had. And so then when I graduated from college, I went back to General Motors for 2 years to work in that countertrade division. And so that was the thread. I was always interested in international business and multinational corporations. And countertrade to me was just a really interesting fit.
Right. So you're already into very complex topics. I mean, international currencies, you're going to London School of Economics, you've already been to Harvard. Do you have an innate ability to take a complex topic and understand it, maybe perhaps better than others? Or is that something where it's just, you're so intellectually curious about it that you dive deep into it and then you're able to maybe speed up your learning curve and learn about a topic quickly? Hey guys, Jacob here. Real quick before we get back to the episode, I just want to take a quick second and say, if you guys are enjoying this episode, please make sure to share the link with a friend. You may have noticed I don't run any ads in the podcast. In fact, I don't make any money off the podcast. It's quite the contrary. Over the past 5 years, I've invested a lot of time, money, and effort into the growth of the show, trying to continually upgrade the equipment, bring on better guests, and just improve the overall quality of the podcast. So if you guys are enjoying this episode or if you enjoyed previous episodes, please share the link with a friend. Sending it to 1 or 2 people makes a huge difference for me on the back end. As always, I appreciate your guys' support. Let's get back into the episode.
Well, I certainly don't bring any innate intelligence to it. So it's much more the factor of being curious. I think that helps. I've always been curious, asked a lot of questions, been interested in learning, open to new ideas, and willing to try some different things. So I think it's really more that than sort of any innate intelligence, that's for sure.
Yeah. Okay. That's super interesting. So then you go back and you're working towards your MBA and then kind of lead the progression from there.
So when I was in my MBA program, there was one thing that they had at Harvard, it was all case studies. And every day you did 3 cases or 2 cases. It alternated Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday. And to help out, most people got involved in a study group. And so I was in a study group. And the study group would meet every night, and you would review the cases with each other, and you would bounce ideas off of each other to prepare for classes the next day. And I was fortunate. My study group had 6 people, including myself, and we were all in different sections. So Harvard had 9 different sections. Each had 90 people. And the good thing about being in a study group with people in different sections is nobody was worried about stealing somebody else's idea.
Right.
So we could freely steal everybody's idea. and so we would share our ideas with each other. And then the next day you go into class and you're prepared with the case and you have all your ideas, and then you can participate. And back then, participation was 50% of the grade.
Okay.
And maybe it was more, but it was a lot. And so you were really encouraged to participate. Anyway, the 6 guys in my study group, 5 of them came from McKinsey. And so it was basically an advertisement for the entire first year, as they were telling me how great it was to be at McKinsey, how much fun they had, how much they learned, what great impact they were having. And so I had that kind of indoctrination for the whole year. But I was interested in consulting coming out of business school for a whole variety of reasons. As I mentioned, it was like a graduate education. But they got me a lot more, I'd say, involved in it, aware of it. And then they helped introduce me to a lot of people that were at McKinsey. So during that first year while I was at Harvard, I learned a lot about McKinsey. Now, for the summer, though, I didn't go to consulting. I actually went back to Ford Motor Company.
Oh, really?
Yeah, I figured I'd branch out. I had done General Motors for a couple of years. So when I went and did my internship, I went to Ford. And Ford and GM couldn't be more different culturally.
Seriously?
I mean, GM is kind of on the east side of Detroit, and Ford is on the west side in Dearborn, and they're just completely different. So it was really interesting for me to be in Ford. I felt like I was in the enemy camp.
Right.
Having been at General Motors. And I'm still a GM person. I've owned a couple of Fords over the years, but I always go back to GM.
Yeah, I could see that. So you have this study group that basically convinced you should go to McKinsey. You want that experience anyways. You have this progression that goes something along the lines of McKinsey's to GE, and then you end up at GE Capital, and then from GE Capital to, was it Spirit at that point?
From GE Capital to Spirit.
To Spirit, and then to Hexel. Like, bring us through, like, and CBS is in there as well. Like, how do you go from all of these different industries from one to the other where they're so different, and you just pick it up and go?
Yeah. So it's about being curious and learning, and learning from the people that you work with. So when I was, just to follow the thread, when I was at McKinsey, I was there for about 5 years and had been doing fine, but it was very project oriented. And I really wanted to get into operations and to leading a company. And so I got an opportunity at Westinghouse. And Westinghouse at that point was like a mini GE. It had industrial businesses, and it had some media businesses and some financial service businesses. And so when they offered me a job, I took it. And the job they offered me was to be the integration manager for CBS. So Westinghouse had just bought CBS.
Okay.
A guy named Michael Jordan, not the basketball player, a guy from Pepsi, who had been at Clayton Dubilier, became CEO of Westinghouse. And he was looking to rebuild it, and he was looking for people. But one of the first big acquisitions they did was CBS. And it wasn't because of media or TV. It was because of radio. And Mike just recognized that radio was deregulating, and it was going to be a monster opportunity. So Westinghouse had several radio stations. CBS had a big radio station. And so I went on board originally to be the integration leader for the business. But then we were there for about a year, and Mike decided, look, Westinghouse was troubled, and it wasn't going to make it. So he decided to sell off all the industrial assets of Westinghouse and change the name of Westinghouse to CBS to make it a pure play media, and then move everything to New York.
Oh, really?
And so I went from being the integration leader of CBS to becoming the vice president of strategy, based in New York, working for Mike Jordan. And the first deal we did was the Infinity deal with Mel Karmazin. And then after that, we did some cable deals, and Mike had a great strategy, and it all played out in the end. But ultimately, I didn't really want to be in a media company.
Right.
And so that's when I left to go to GE. And I got a call from a recruiter and I ended up at GE Capital. And I wasn't a financial service person, but that was what they had. And it was international. They had a group called Global Consumer Finance, and it was growing very fast, and they needed somebody, head of strategy, that they could help them grow. And so I joined GE Capital Global Consumer Finance, which was one of the 32 bubbles. And GE Capital back then was really a hot commodity. It was growing fast. There was a guy named Gary Wendt. And the business I was in, GE Consumer Finance, it had $13 billion of assets, about $250 million of net income when I joined.
Oh my gosh.
And in the next 10 years, we did 60 deals in 50 different countries, and it went up to $250 billion of assets and $4.5 billion of net income.
How exhilarating was that ride?
It was unbelievable. And I learned so much. And so about 2 years into it, though, from strategy, I became the vice president of quality. And then I got my master black belt. But then they decided to send me to France for my first job as an operating leader. And so I ran GE Money, it was called GE Consumer Finance France then, but we changed our name to GE Money. And then from France, I went to Australia, and I was in Australia. And it was there that my boss said, look, you're going from, the business in France was about $2.5 billion of assets, and the one in Australia was about $5 billion at the time. He said, it's a much bigger job, and we'd just done a big acquisition, and so there was a lot of integration work to do. But he said, look, you're going to need to learn a lot. And the one thing you should do is you've got a great team, learn from your team. And that was probably some of the best advice I ever got, because when you go into a job, even if you are hierarchically the leader, the people underneath you often know a lot more about the business and the organization and the industry than you do, and you can learn a lot. And I did.
Yeah.
And so that turned out to be a great experience going to Australia. But I was in Australia for about 5 years, and then they asked me to come back and lead marketing for Global Consumer Finance, which was GE Money by then. So I did that, but I liked running businesses.
Right.
And so that was kind of a move into a functional role. It was a very big global functional role, but it was still functional.
Why would they ask you to go to marketing? That seems very different than, I guess, maybe the media background at CBS.
Well, they wanted to drive growth. And when I was in Australia, we had done 4 or 5 major acquisitions. We grew it from about $5 billion in assets to $30 billion. And so that was what they wanted to continue to drive in GE Money. And so they asked me to come back and lead marketing to help drive growth across the whole organization.
Okay. Yep.
So, but I was there for about 1.5 years, and I got a call from headquarters HR, and they said, well, we'd like you to now go to aviation. And I said, well, I haven't been in industrial since I've been in GE. I've been in financial services. And they said, yeah, but we want to really drive growth in GE Aviation, specifically services, which was the maintenance, repair, and overhaul of the jet engines. And so that sounded really like a lot of fun. And it was based in Cincinnati. So we relocated to Cincinnati, and I became head of the service business at GE Aviation. And that's how I got involved in aviation.
Yeah.
And that was a great opportunity, because in aviation at GE, the engines, it's a razor and razor blade model. They make the engines, and these are the most sophisticated pieces of machinery in the world by far. I mean, the reliability is just off the charts. They run an 8-hour cycle, and they turn around and they run another 8-hour cycle. Their dispatch reliability is 99.999%, and the quality is off the charts. So it was a great experience, but they make no money on the engines. They sell the engines at a loss, and all the money is made in the aftermarket. And that's what I was running, was the aftermarket. So the spare parts, the maintenance, repair, and overhaul. And so it was a fascinating learning experience of getting back into industrial, but in aviation, and learning about how to operate in that kind of a global environment, highly regulated environment. And so I was there for about 4 years. And then I got a call to go to healthcare. The leader of the healthcare business that was running the diagnostic imaging and the medical device business, his name was Omar Ishraq. He had just left to go become CEO of Medtronic. And so that job was open. And again, they wanted to drive growth, and I had a reputation for driving growth. And so I went to lead the healthcare business. And I did that for about 4 years. And then there was another problem back at GE Capital. So after the financial crisis in 2007, that had really caused a lot of problems with the basic business model of GE Capital being a large financial institution within an industrial business.
Right.
And the Federal Reserve had started to really highly regulate GE Capital. In fact, they came up with a new segment of financial institutions called SIFIs, systemically important financial institutions. And there were only about 6 or 7, but GE Capital was one of them.
Yeah.
Because it was the 6th largest financial institution in the world. And so GE Capital was really struggling to meet all the regulatory requirements of the Federal Reserve. So Jeff Immelt called me and asked if I would go back to GE Capital and help figure out how to either transform GE Capital into a SIFI or figure out what to do with it. Mm-hmm. And so I went back as president and COO, reporting to the chairman of GE Capital at the time was Keith Sharon. And the long story short was we determined we couldn't become a SIFI. It just was not possible. We had hired 8,000 people in risk and compliance and regulatory.
Oh my gosh.
We were spending $500 million a year on consulting, and we just were not going to get there. It was clear. And the Fed had all these requirements. It was called CCAR to do all the capital assessments, and we weren't going to get there. So we decided at that point to start selling off GE Capital. And so I helped in that process for a couple of years. But it was clear there wasn't another role for me at GE. Mm-hmm. And so at that point, I had a decision to make. I said, I have 3 majors. I have financial services from GE Capital. I had my GE aviation experience, and I had healthcare. And so I was looking at all 3 of those industries in terms of going forward. And I picked aviation because I said, aviation looks like it will be the most fun. And maybe it was a mistake, but at the time, we were right in the middle of a super cycle. Mm-hmm. Since 2001, aviation had grown, air traffic had grown 7% a year, every year. And it was doubling every 10 or 12 years. And there was a backlog at that point of 13,000 large commercial aircraft, and all of them had to be built. And so as I was talking to different people, some of my former customers from GE Aviation were on the board of Spirit Aerosystems. And I didn't really know anything about Spirit. I knew the airline, mm-hmm. but I didn't know much about the structures business. And so they invited me to come to Wichita, and I met the then CEO, a guy named Larry Lawson, who was also from Detroit. So we shared that common background. And I thought, well, this is great. It's the leader. It's the largest structures business. All these aircraft have to get built, mm-hmm. and Spirit's in a really great position and a big opportunity to diversify. So I joined originally as the chief operating officer in 2016, and then Larry ended up leaving just a couple months later, and I became the CEO.
Wow. So you ended up picking a very regulated industry. Like to me, that's a lot of red tape and a lot of headache. Whereas you had 2 other majors that you're interested in. Sure, they have their own regulations, but aviation is perhaps the most difficult. Is that what was enticing about it? Or how did you conceptualize that?
Well, I would say all 3 have their share of regulation. I mean, financial services with the Fed, if you're a SIFI, or if you're a consumer bank, you have the CFPB, the Consumer Finance Protection Bureau. And federal, the FDA for healthcare is maybe even more rigorous than the FAA in aviation. So I would say they're all 3 highly regulated industries. But to me, that was a competency. It's something that I had developed of how to operate in a highly regulated industry. And so it's not something that's enjoyable per se, but it's a skill set, and it has to be done because those are 3 industries that all do need a heavy amount of regulation. Mm-hmm. So it wasn't something that I never even thought about the regulatory aspect of it. To me, it was all about the growth. And as I looked at aviation, it was international. It helped connect people. It was highly technical, and it was growing, and it was going to be a huge part of the future. Mm-hmm. And so those were the things that really appealed to me. And I think if you think about aviation, not just in terms of commercial aviation, but also in terms of military aviation, fixed wing aircraft, rotary craft, thinking about missiles and autonomy, thinking about space vehicles, aviation writ large is quite a comprehensive industry with a lot of very interesting characteristics.
Yeah, it's very impactful for the future and everything that could come.
It is.
So, I mean, one of the benefits, you get to end up in Wichita, Kansas if you go to Spirit Aerosystems. I feel like that's just the cherry on top.
That was an interesting aspect of it. I was talking to some people, and I was living at the time in Stamford, Connecticut, which is where GE Capital was based. They were in Norwalk. I was living in Westport, but it was in Fairfield County. And when I told my friends, they thought I had absolutely lost my mind. They said, why on earth would you ever move to Wichita?
Yeah.
We don't even know where it is. I'm not sure there's a direct flight there from New York. In fact, there isn't. But I came to visit, and I grew up in Detroit. And Wichita actually reminded me a little bit of Detroit. It was a manufacturing-oriented town.
Yeah.
It's actually a great place to raise a family.
Mm-hmm.
The schools here are good. There's a lot to do. We like outdoor activities. There's plenty of outdoor activities. And it's actually, I mean, even though there aren't direct flights to a lot of places, you're in the middle of the country. So it's easy to get to either coast. And that was all very attractive. So we've loved living here. We've been here now 8 years and have really enjoyed it. And my daughter graduated from high school here. My son's in high school and is enjoying it, has lots of friends. And I think this has been a great place to raise a family.
It's really good people too. I often talk about, I grew up in St. Louis, came to Wichita just for the scholarship from Wichita State University. I knew nothing about this city at all and fully intended to leave after college. But then when I graduated, there's just so many good people offering so many opportunities. And I feel like Wichita is kind of a sleeper city in the sense that it'll pull you in and the people here actually care. And it is a good Midwestern style of living that maybe you can't get elsewhere.
Right. We've made a lot of friends here. And, you mentioned Midwestern. And when I first came here and people said Midwest, I said, Midwest? This is far west. I always thought Midwest was kind of Michigan, Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, maybe Minnesota. But certainly not Pennsylvania. But I always thought of Kansas and Colorado and Nebraska as kind of the Great Plains.
Yeah.
But it's considered technically part of the Midwest.
Yeah. So as we analyze like this trajectory that we're talking about, we got up to Spirit. Like in those early days, whenever you're coming out of Harvard and you have all of this potential, you've already had some really solid items on your resume. Like, how much were you working? Like, what did it take in order to continue to carry that momentum that you were generating to get you to the point of where you are now? Like, what did those early days in that work ethic look like?
I think to be successful, you always have to work hard. You should work smart. Again, I had bosses at GE that really tried to emphasize to work smart and conserve your time and energy and focus on the right things. If I could figure out the right things all the time, that would be great. It's always hard to do it. Much easier said than done. But I've always worked hard. I've always been open to new opportunities. And maybe that's something that I think that has helped me is when those opportunities came up, even if it involved relocating, we were willing to do that as a family. And that, again, going to France and getting a job to run an opportunity to run a business in GE was a great opportunity. Mm-hmm. Going to Australia and running an even bigger business was great. Then we moved back to Stanford. And then from Stanford, went to Cincinnati to run the GE Aviation Services business. Then I went to Milwaukee to run the healthcare business. Then I had to go back to Stanford for GE Capital. And then we moved to Wichita. So, but being willing to move, I think, opened up some opportunities. I'm not saying you have to do it,
right?
But for me, it was helpful. So that was one thing. Now, it creates its own sense of hardship, certainly for the family to move around. Mm-hmm. But it also has provided my kids with some great opportunities to meet people from all over the world and learn about different cultures and interact with people. And they've kept friends in all the different spaces. And it's a little bit easier now, of course, with social media.
Right.
So my daughter keeps in touch with her friends from Australia and from Connecticut and from Ohio. We were just back in Ohio, for example. Her best friend from high school got married, and we went back there, and we got to connect with a lot of our friends from Cincinnati.
That's really cool. And those experiences when you're young are so invaluable because, like, you really are just the compilation of the experiences that you've had, and for them to be able to live internationally and experience that, I can only imagine how it's going to help them in the long run too.
Yeah, it's a positive experience. There's always drawbacks to it, but and I would say if you look at a career, if you live in one place, you may have to travel a lot. So when I was a consultant, we lived in Cleveland, and I traveled every week, 4 or 5 days a week. That was just how consultants worked back then. I think still that's pretty much how they do it. When I went to GE, I didn't travel as much. Still a little bit of travel, but every 2 or 3 years we ended up moving. So we relocated as a family 12 times.
Oh my gosh!
And so that was a lot. It's not like a military career, though. When you look at a military resume, somebody who's been in the military 40 years, they've moved 20 times. Mm-hmm. And so it's just part of I would say, just part of the requirements for a job or a role like that.
I'm curious about how you make those types of decisions. Like, you're clearly a very ambitious person who's done well. A lot of my listeners are younger people like myself. I'm 23. I have a lot of ambition, but I don't have a family yet. But that's something that I would love to have down the road. And it's like, how do you weigh out the opportunity that may require you to move? Or how do you balance the ambition of working hours and moving while relocating your family? Like, how do you make those decisions?
Well, you have to discuss it with your family. My wife and I have always done that, and with the kids. And so sometimes you have to make some sacrifices. So, for example, when I was in Cincinnati and got moved to Milwaukee, so I was at GE Aviation and they moved me up to GE Healthcare. My daughter was a junior and she wanted to finish up school where she was. So I just commuted for those 2 years. I'd leave on Sunday, come home Friday night. And I was traveling a lot anyway, so it wasn't as bad as it might sound. But that was part of the sacrifice, I guess you have to say. And similarly, when we moved here from Wichita, my one daughter was just finishing up her freshman year of high school. That was a difficult decision to move her, but we talked to her about it. She was willing to do it. I think she was not fitting in as well at the school in Connecticut, and she had a great time here. So that ended up being a good move. When we moved from Connecticut to Cincinnati, my oldest daughter was in the 7th grade, and she was going to go into the 8th grade. She didn't want to leave. She had great friends. She said she was going to hate me forever. I think she's gotten over that. It's been 15 years or so. No, but she ended up making great friends in Cincinnati, lifelong friends, and we just went to her best friend's wedding. And,
nice.
and she and her friend there are still great friends.
Yeah.
So it's something you just have to figure out with the family. And sometimes you just might have to commute a little while until you get through a particular phase of their life, like school.
Yeah. No, that makes a lot of sense. Do you believe in the idea of work-life balance?
I would call it today, especially work-life harmony. Balance implies a trade-off. It's one or the other. And for better or worse, that's not how I think it is anymore. And specifically, it's because of the phones that I have in my pocket. You probably have yours in your pocket.
Yeah.
You're never really disconnected. I remember it was 2004, I think it was, or 2005. I came back to the U.S. I was living in Australia, and I went to a meeting, our global kickoff meeting. And the guy sitting next to me was my colleague who ran the Americas business. And he had this thing, and he was pounding away on it all during the presentations. And at the break, I said, what is that thing? He goes, well, it's a BlackBerry.
Oh.
And I said, what are you doing with it? He said, well, I'm doing email. I said, you're doing email on that little device? We had Palm Pilots, and I'm dating myself, but Palm Pilots weren't very effective. But this BlackBerry was really effective. We didn't have them in Australia. And we resisted for a little while because I said, once we get them, the number of emails is just going to skyrocket. Yep. We're all going to spend our time distracted playing on our BlackBerry when we should be listening to the presentations at the meeting. Yep. And of course, that's exactly what happened when we got them. But that, anyway, we now live in a world of smartphones and you're kind of connected 24/7. So you don't really detach from work per se. And so to me, it's about how do you create harmony in your work and life so that they both work together.
Right.
And it's not a question of trading off one or the other. It's how do you make it work? And it's not easy, but it requires a lot of discipline. It sometimes requires help. My wife is very good about slapping me upside the head if I ever try to pull out my Apple phone now at dinner. And you just have to make sure you segment your life properly. I mean, be accessible, have harmony, but also make sure when you are with your family and friends is that you're spending time with them and not being distracted by work, and vice versa, is being focused when you're at work.
That's one of my favorite things about podcasting is for about an hour, there's no other technology other than what is recording the conversation. And it forces like that nice intimacy of getting to actually talk to the person one-on-one with no distractions. Yeah. I mean, the intrusiveness of phones is crazy. I mean, if you think about like Pavlov's dog, you ring the bell and the dog satiates for the food and you hear a phone go off and ding and you yourself or your friend immediately look down at the phone to watch wherever it may be. It really is crazy to see how that has changed human behavior and the way people interact.
I agree. I mean, for one, I when I'm on my computer, I don't have the chat function on so that
Smart.
Because I get distracted.
Right.
And when I'm on my computer, I like to be as productive as possible and get through the things and devote myself to that. But text messages can be very distracting. Mm-hmm. I mean, if it rings on your watch or it shows up on your phone, you want to just look. And so you have to be disciplined.
You mentioned your wife helps keep you on track. I think that's super important. How'd you guys meet?
Well, it was in business school, and I had just come back from Detroit, drove back with my roommate for the first day of business school, second year. Mm-hmm. And we drove, it was like a 12 or 13 hour drive from Detroit to Boston. And we got there, and he was in the school play, so he had to go to rehearsal. And so I went out with a couple of other friends to just a bar across the street. And I was in the bar. It was a place called the Boathouse. And I was with my friends. And I said, I'll go get some drinks. I went up there and I couldn't get the bartender's attention. And there was this nice lady next to me. She said, do you need some help getting the bartender's attention? I said, yeah, he was not paying any attention to me. So she called him over and he came over and then we started talking and that's how I met her. So it's not very glamorous or anything, but that's how we met. And then we started dating and we dated all during the time of my second year. And then we moved to Cleveland, we got engaged and then we got married.
Oh my gosh, that's incredible. So what was she studying in school?
Well, she wasn't in school. At that point, she was a court reporter in Boston. So, and now a court reporter, I thought she wrote for a newspaper or something, but in fact, she was a stenographer.
Oh, okay.
And so she took depositions. And it's still a very lucrative career because you get, even with all technology and digitization, there's still stenographers. And because you need a written record. And so with computers, you can write the deposition and then you make copies of it and you get paid for each copy. So it's a very lucrative career. So she and her friends were just kind of rolling in money. And I mean, coming out of Harvard Business School, she made more money than I did the first 4 or 5 years.
Oh, that's awesome.
Yeah, so it was interesting. So she was a great find. And she kind of carried me for the first 4 or 5 years of our marriage.
Oh, that's great. How long did you guys date before you decided to get married?
It was about 2 years. Yeah, 2 years.
Nice. That's super exciting. So I'm curious, as you go again on this trajectory we're talking about, and now you're leading 15 or 20,000 people at the peak, like, I don't know how anyone could possibly prepare to lead an organization that size. Did you have any sort of mentor or any sort of person that you looked up to help guide you along the way?
Well, I would say GE was a great training ground for leaders. Now, it's disparaged now, and there's all sorts of rewriting history, but there's no doubt that GE was a great training ground. And it really put a lot of effort into training and professional development. It had its own campus. It was called Crotonville, and it was a GE university. And so throughout your career at GE, you would go to various training programs at every level, and you would learn about leadership, and you would learn about communication and strategy and all those things. But mostly you would learn about leadership. And the great thing at GE is you had all these great mentors, starting with Jack Welch. I mean, when I was there, Jack Welch was still there. And I got to meet him a few times and interact with him a little bit. First time I met with him was up at the headquarters at Fairfield for our strategic review. And I was just in the business for a couple months. And my job at the first strategic review was very important. It was to pass out all the books at the table. And so I was in the process of passing out all the books at the table. And somebody comes up behind me and says, "Hey, who are you? I don't know who you are." And I looked over and that was Jack Welch. And he was talking, and he said, "I'm Jack. Who are you?" And I said, "Well, I'm Tom." He goes, so that's how I met Jack Welch. And he was very outgoing, and he insisted you call him Jack.
For everyone that doesn't know, who's Jack Welch?
Well, Jack was the CEO of GE. And at that time, he was very popular and well-known. He was kind of like an Elon Musk or a Jeff Bezos of that time.
Yeah.
Different, but yeah, so for the newer people that might not know, Jack Welch was that. Anyway, so Jack was a great leader, very different personality from me, very different style, but I could see how he led. And there were lots of other leaders at GE that I worked for or with or just interacted with. And so I would say what I learned about leadership, a lot of it was at GE and watching other people be leaders. Probably my biggest mentor was the person who was CEO at GE Consumer Finance, which became GE Money. And his name was Dave Nissen. I worked for him for 10 years, still keep in touch with him. One of the best leaders I've ever met. And he taught me a lot about leadership and just managing time and managing a business and managing people. And so I valued that mentorship that I got at GE.
When you say he's one of the best leaders you've ever met, like what attributes or what immediately comes to mind that you put him in that category?
Well, first of all, he was ruthless with his time management. He tried not to waste time. He was very focused. He picked on the priorities. Very strategic person. Knew what he was good at and what he wasn't good at. And he was able to surround himself with a team of people that could fill in the gaps. And that the sum of that parts was way more than each individual. And so those are some of the things I learned is to how to build a great team, how to lead a team, how to think strategically, how to be ruthless with time management, how to try to be efficient. But also he had a lot of fun. He had a lot of great traditions. One of the traditions we had in our annual meeting, our annual kickoff meeting, as I said, we were in 50 countries. We had a flag up on the ceiling for all 50 countries.
Oh,
and
that's
we
sweet.
would start the meeting off and we would say, name all the countries, and we go through and name every country. And inevitably somebody would miss something and
Right.
we'd have to get help. But we went through all 50 countries. That's how we started the meeting off. And then we ended the meeting. He always had a prayer, the Irish prayer. The road rides us up to meet you, and God holds you in the palm of his hand. And that's how he ended every meeting. And so, these were just, to me, great ways to build a tradition in a business that creates a culture. And culture is so important in business, but those are some of just a few of the things I learned from Dave Nissen.
Seeing him do that, whenever you went to Spirit, were there any extra efforts you made to build some sort of tradition or culture like that?
Well, we did. We started off, for example, we came up with a set of values, transparency, collaboration, inspiration, and we tried to reinforce that. We came up with a mission statement that helped define what our purpose was. We had an annual kickoff meeting where we brought together everybody. So those were things that I borrowed from GE and in terms of the style and the format of it. And those were some of the things that we learned to build the culture. The other thing we did is we had our executive leadership team, but then we created something we called our senior leadership council, which was all of the kind of the vice presidents and above. So a group of about 40 people. And that was something I learned at GE Aviation, where my boss there was a guy named David Joyce. He had that kind of a group. And it was bigger than the executive leadership team, which was about 8 to 10 people, but it spread out across the whole organization. And it was a way to directly impact the culture and the development of those important leaders who were maybe 1 or 2 levels below me, but still extremely influential in the organization.
Right.
So those were some of the mechanisms and tools that we applied at Spirit that I learned at GE.
And as we're talking about Spirit, I mean, that's a large company. It's a publicly traded company. What is it like leading a publicly traded company? I mean, on one end, you're trying to focus on your core competencies, the business itself. But on the other end, you have so many other factors you got to deal with: the public scrutiny, stock price. You've got a lot of shareholders. What is it like to run a publicly traded company?
Well, I would say it's very different than running a large division of a much larger corporation. So when I was at GE, I ran some big businesses. So GE Money was $30 billion in assets, and it was about $450 million in net income in Australia. And then when I went to GE Aviation Services, that business was about $7 billion of revenue, and we had operations all over the world, and it was very profitable, of course, because it was the services, and and you see that today now that it's a standalone public company. And then I went to GE Healthcare, and at that time it was about $14 billion, and very big global business, and we had P&Ls and different modalities and diagnostic imaging and medical devices. And so I thought, well, I know how to run a big business. And I've run many big businesses. And I went to G Capital and I was chief operating officer. So I said, I'm certainly ready to run a public company. Now, not everybody thinks that, by the way. And the fact is there's a world of difference between running a big division at a company like GE and running a public company, even if it's a smaller public company like Spirit. It's just a completely different job. Because for one thing, you have both sides of the balance sheet. You've got not only the asset side that you've got to manage and the growth, but you've got the liabilities. So you've got to manage cash, you've got to manage debt, other liabilities, and that's a big difference. You've got you mentioned stockholders. You've got to manage shareholders. You've got to manage a board of directors. You've got credit agencies. You've got analysts on Wall Street. You've got the press and the media. You've got government officials. You've got the community. It is completely different. And so I went into Spirit thinking, well, Spirit's a much smaller business than I've run. This will be a fairly easy transition. It couldn't have been more different. I found that I had a lot to learn.
Right.
And sometimes you learn it, and you learn some hard lessons. And so, but it's a very different type of job, but it's one I really like and enjoy. because it does put you out there with a lot of different stakeholders. So you have your customers, of course, you have your employees, you have suppliers, you have your regulatory and statutory, like the board, the shareholders, the analysts, the credit agencies. You work with the government officials and the media, but you have the local communities and employees. And so you have so many different stakeholders that you're interacting with. So it's definitely a full-on job, very fulfilling, but very difficult and challenging. And it's always changing. And curveballs come every day.
Yeah. I mean, with so many stakeholders and curveballs coming at being such a large company, I mean, how do you at the individual level handle adversity when it comes? I mean, there's a handful of events that came up that, like, how do you as a person, you need to get the outcome. Yes, you need to right the ship or deal with whatever the actual issue is, but then also there has to be just an immense amount of pressure that you feel running that organization. How do you deal with adversity personally?
Well, I think you have to remain calm, keep everything in perspective. And I'll just say one thing for a second. At some level, it gets down to time management. Mm-hmm. And I participated in a course when I first became CEO at Spirit. It was at Harvard for new CEOs. It was like 3 or 4 days, and it was taught by Nitin Naraya, who was the dean at the time of Harvard Business School, and Michael Porter, the guru of strategy. And one of the modules, so they had modules on strategy and team building and investor relations, but one of the modules was time management. Mm-hmm. And I thought, well, this will be an interesting module, not maybe very impactful. Turns out it was by far the most interesting, impactful module that we studied, because it was, how do you manage your time in a very organized way? And at the end of the course, they said, hey, we're doing a study, we're putting together a paper, and we're interviewing CEOs, and we asked them to keep a diary of their time, how they spent their time, and then we analyze it and we feed it back to you, and we compare then all these new CEOs, how they spend their time. I thought everybody was going to do it. Turns out I was the only one in the class. But
oh my gosh.
I kept my diary for 3 months. My executive assistant hated me because it was a lot of work.
Right.
But after that, they gave me all this feedback. And then they wrote an article, and the article did very well. But what it showed about time management is that it changes. So at that time, this was 2016, they had a module that says, how much time do you spend on crisis management? And it was less than 1%.
Right.
And so when they put my report together and they showed it all, it was less than 1%. I spent a lot of time with customers. I spent a lot of time on strategy, all good things, but only 1% on crisis management. In 2018, most people would be familiar, there was the first crash of a MAX mm-hmm. in Indonesia. Now, the MAX was a very important aircraft for Spirit because it represented 50% of the revenue. Spirit built 70% of the structure for the MAX. It was 50% of the revenue. So that was a traumatic event. And all of a sudden, crisis management ticked up. But crashes unfortunately happen, and people learn from them and move on. And that was what was happening with that first crash. But then there was a second crash in March of 2019. And then we went into full-on crisis management mode. Every day we had a meeting at 6 a.m., try to figure out what we were going to do next. And we had to do a lot of things in order to manage that first set of crises. But we weren't I thought we were in a serious crisis. I had yet to experience a real crisis, though, because we kept producing during that time period from March till the end of December of 2019. And the idea was we were going to produce, and then as soon as it got back on track, we were going to store units, and then we were going to burn them off once the aircraft was recertified. Mm. It didn't get recertified and it ended up until November of 2020. But by the end of 2019, Boeing got into real trouble with the FAA, and they stopped production. That was a huge crisis.
Right.
Because we went from producing 52 aircraft a month that represented half our revenue and a lot more of our cash flow to zero. And so between December 15th and January 8th, we had to plan a layoff of 5,000 people, which was about,
oh my gosh,
at that point, 40% of our workforce. And we had to draw our revolver, and we had to figure out how we were going to cut costs and how were we going to survive. Mm-hmm. And so we did all those things, and then the pandemic hit. And so we started crisis management, basically in March of 2019, and it just kept getting worse. And I didn't think it could keep getting worse, but it did.
Yeah.
All the way up until 2023, when we also then had a labor strike. So crisis management went from less than 1% to probably a lot more than 100% of time. And you just have to keep things in perspective. Throughout that whole time, the focus was, first of all, we've got to continue to do the things that we have to do. We couldn't control a lot, so manage what we could control, deliver the requirements for our customers, make sure we were fair and reasonable with our employees, try to be good stewards for our shareholders, continue to be a contributor to the community. One thing we did during that time period, which I think helped keep our sanity, was we started building ventilators. So in March of 2020, production had gone to basically zero on the MAX, and we were still producing some of the other aircraft, but we had lots of excess capacity, and we were looking at having to lay off even more people. We'd already laid off, at that point, about 8,000. And I got a call from a friend at McKinsey, and he said, look, there's a company that's building respirators. And this is at the time when, with the pandemic, people were saying that respirators were in heavy need, and there was a huge shortage of them. And so they had invoked the Defense Production Act, like they had in World War II, to convert a lot of the auto companies to building ventilators.
Oh, interesting.
And so my friend called and said, hey, one of your old colleagues at GE Healthcare is now running a respiratory company called Vyaire, and they need somebody who can dedicate a factory and train staff and knows how to build things tomorrow. Can you take it on? I said, sure. They had just gotten an order for 42,000 critical care ventilators. So we set up a factory up by the airport. We trained over 1,000 people. We created 3 shifts. We learned how to build ventilators, and we ended up building about 25,000 critical care ventilators and shipping them all over the world. And it kept 1,000 people employed for almost a year. And so that was, some way to just kind of keep our sanity while everything else seemed to be falling apart. And in fact, in 2020, I joke about this, but it's probably not really a joke, but we made more money building ventilators than we did aircraft parts by a lot, because we lost about $1 billion on aircraft parts, and we made about $60 million on ventilators. So,
oh my gosh,
that was an interesting time.
So you're having one thing go wrong after another. I mean, you lay off 5,000 people, and just these unfortunate events keep happening. You're clearly very analytically minded, and that's why you've been a successful CEO and leading organizations. But like at the end of the day, were you feeling overwhelmed? I mean, with the amount of pressure that stacked up, like how were you feeling emotionally at that point?
Well, there was a lot of work to do, but I would say at the time it was a big team. We as I said, we had this crisis management. It went for a long time at 6 a.m. and everybody would get together and we'd work out the issues and talk, and then we'd do things together, go out to dinners and hang out and talk a lot. So I'd say it for me, the thing that helped the most was it wasn't all just me.
Right.
It was the team. And working with the team and making the decisions with the team helped out. I mean, I never felt like I made an individual decision. We always talked about it and collaborated and reached a consensus on what we were going to do, because they were hard decisions to make. Mm-hmm. And we didn't have all the answers or the information. You had to just go by with what you had at the time. But during that whole period, I would say, having that strong team in place was very valuable.
Yeah, and I'm sure that crisis made you guys stronger because you had that shared experience that you were working through together.
Yeah, I'm still very good friends with all those folks and keep in touch with them. I mean, as you know, at Spirit, things kept disintegrating and getting tougher and tougher. And I eventually left. A lot of the other people have left, but we all keep in touch. And I think the bonds we formed during that time have been very strong and will be lifelong friendships.
That's pretty cool. So you left for Hexcel. I don't know much about that move. How has that been?
It's been great. I mean, Hexcel is a maker of carbon fiber composites, which is lightweight material, which is used in aircraft production for both military and commercial and space. And I would say Spirit was the largest user of carbon fiber composite material to make aircraft structures. And so then going upstream to Hexcel to actually making the material has been a learning experience. It's a very technology-oriented company. It's material science. It's chemistry, essentially. You take acrylonitrile and you transform it into these fiber tows, and then you, from there, put resins into it to pre-preg it, and then you give it to companies like Spirit, who form it into aircraft structures and then cure it and harden it into these materials. So carbon fiber composite is 5 times stronger than aluminum and 30% lighter.
Oh my gosh.
So it's the material of the future. And so for me, to be honest, when I was at Spirit and we were developing our strategy in 2018, 2019, before the crashes and before the pandemic hit, we looked at carbon fiber as the material of the future, and that this was going to be how the industry gets transformed. And we, of course, looked a lot at Hexcel and what they were doing. And there's only 3 companies that make aerospace-grade carbon fiber composites. And so what happened was the CEO, it was a good friend of mine, Nick Stanage, was retiring. And so they were launching a search. So just as literally the day I left Spirit, I got a call from the headhunter.
Yeah.
And he said, hey, I'm going to be at the Wings Club meeting in New York in 3 weeks. Let's meet. I've got a job that might be of interest to you.
How serendipitous is that?
Well, it worked out. But it was a long process, and the process went about 6 months. So it didn't happen all, but the first inklings of it came early on. And for me, it was a good fit. For Hexcel, it was a good fit. And, same program, same customers, a different part of the industry.
Mm-hmm.
So for me, it was a chance to go into something that I really believed was going to be a big part of the future of aviation, and to be able to contribute to that just as I was leaving Spirit. And so that it worked out.
Is it that curiosity of being able to work on something on the forefront of the future that helped you make the decision to continue working? Because I feel like you probably could have retired rather than continue to work a lot of hours and to build something. You must have found this pretty meaningful to make that decision.
Well, yeah, I mean, I've always been very passionate about aerospace.
Mm-hmm.
Ever since I got involved in it back at GE, to me, it's a noble industry. It helps connect the world. It connects people. It connects goods and services. It serves obviously a very important military function as well. And so it's a very noble industry, and I've always been very passionate about it. And we're at a juncture right now where, this generation of aircraft is kind of getting toward the end, especially the narrow body, which is the workhorse of the industry. And we're starting to think about the next generation. And the narrow body, so the MAX or the A320, are only 15% carbon fiber composite. The next generation will have a lot more carbon fiber composite. Mm-hmm. And so to have the opportunity to be a part of that and to help shape that future was just too much to pass up.
Yeah.
And, I spent so much time over the last 7-8 years in aviation and working on these structures that to be part of that future to me was just a great opportunity.
I think it's cool that you can clearly hear the passion in your voice, because a lot of people work a lot of hours for a large portion of their life, and they look back and they're like, man, I don't know what I did at that time. But for you to still have this level of excitement, I think it's pretty unique and pretty special.
Yeah. Well, it's a great industry. And, I was fortunate to join Hexcel. It's got a great team and a great set of products and a unique position in the marketplace. And so a lot of opportunity for the future. And, again, we're still in the recovery. Mm-hmm. So if you look back to 2019, and then we went into 2020, air traffic dropped 96% in April of 2020. So the biggest drop in the whole history of aviation. Well, it's more than recovered now. So it's today about 10 to 15% higher than it was in 2019, air traffic. And so aircraft are very, very full. But production hasn't recovered. So production in 2018 peaked at 1,737 units. Now, you had the issue in 2019 where MAXs were being built but not delivered, but production peaked in 2018. 2024, production was just under 1,300. So it's only 80% of where it was. Probably won't get back to 2017 levels, 2018 levels of production until 2027. Mm-hmm. So it's about an 8-year recovery. By comparison, if you look at 9/11, when air traffic dropped, it only dropped about 40%, and it recovered more or less fully in 6 months. Mm-hmm. So the pandemic, air traffic dropped by 96%, and it took about 4 years to recover. Production is going to take 8 years to recover. So the situation has been very challenging for original equipment makers.
Is there any, so as we talk about upstream versus downstream, with you guys being at probably the first step of having the materials, and then Spirit, for example, would be the second step of compiling those materials, and then the third or fourth step would be the actual airplane you hop on to go fly. I mean, those all represent different businesses, but they're all in the same stream that you're referencing. Airlines, I think one of them just closed down, but they have profitability is a very difficult thing for them. I know that the margins are very tight, and that was one of the big drops, and that ultimately affected you guys, the suppliers, during COVID. Is there any sort of concern over airlines and their profitability, or are people always going to fly, and so therefore airlines will just have to find a way to exist?
No, it's a very important question. And, there's the old saying that what's the best way to become a millionaire? And it's start off as a billionaire and buy an airline.
That's great.
And airlines have just historically not been profitable. If I go back to when I was at GE Aviation, 2008 to 2012, at that point, I think it was fair to say that in the history of aviation, if you added up the profitability of the industry every single year and netted it out, it was still below zero. Now, since then, with the increase in air traffic and load factors and pricing and fuel prices came down, which is the biggest cost. And so airlines became profitable. But for example, this year, IATA just indicated that in 2025, airlines will pass $1 trillion for the first time. But their profitability will be $36 billion, which is 3.6%. Now, $36 billion for the airline industry is a massive amount of profitability.
Right.
Okay, but 3.6% is not very high.
No, not at all.
And if you look at the way they make their money, at least in the U.S., I'd say most of the airlines probably break even on the airline operations and make their money on subsequent services and mostly the credit cards.
Yeah,
and the loyalty programs. So airlines are a tough business, but it's the basis for everything. Everything starts with them. They buy airplanes. The airplane makers buy engines. They buy parts. The parts makers buy materials. And so it all starts with the airlines. So the airlines have to be profitable. But the good news is that right now they're in a period where they are very profitable. I mean, if you've looked at airline prices recently, they're pretty sky high.
Yeah, which is interesting because then the consumer complains about it. But then if you drop prices too low, then the airline industry is gone.
Right.
So it's a delicate balance.
It is. And it's very elastic. When prices go up, people stop flying. And look, it's a cyclical industry.
Yeah.
And it's always been a cyclical industry. Now, when I was at Spirit, when I first joined in 2016, everybody thought, maybe we're post-cycle. Maybe the cycle doesn't exist anymore. We're in a super cycle, and it's just going to keep going up. And we all thought that until, unfortunately, the crashes of the MAX started the process, and then the pandemic finished it off, and we went into a down cycle. Now we're coming back into an up cycle, but unfortunately, this is a long cycle business. Product cycle times are 30, 40 years, but it's cyclical.
Yeah.
And you just have to understand it's going to go up and down.
I mean, I feel like that's kind of how life is too. You just got to ride it out and be resilient.
That's absolutely true.
Tom, as we start to wrap up, I just have a couple more questions. The first one being, I'm curious, how do you decompress? Like some people like to work out or watch a movie or grab a drink or sauna, ice bath. Like for you, how do you like to decompress?
Well, I enjoy working out, do that. I don't do it nearly enough. Spending time with my family. We like to travel together and go out to eat and things like that. Play golf. And I've tried to teach my daughters golf. It hasn't really picked up with them. My son is a very good golfer. He's far better than I am now. So we do that. And now my daughter's married. She's got her husband. My other daughter has a boyfriend, and they like golf. And so when we go on vacations, my son and the husband and the boyfriend all go play golf together, and that's fun. And for me, golf it's not relaxing. It's the exact opposite of relaxing, but it's distracting. So it takes my mind off everything because I'm so focused on how did I hit that shot, or oh my God, I got to get over that lake, and so it takes my mind off of everything. So it's not relaxing, but I find it very enjoyable because it diverts my attention from other things.
Right. It's something that you can fully focus on and give your best effort to.
Best effort. Yeah, that's a good way to describe it.
That's how my golf game is, at least. Well, Tom, I just want to say real quick, I really appreciate you. You made time for John and I when we were running Player Card in college, and I had no concept of how busy you were at that point in your life, and you made time to meet with us. And then when the restaurant opened, you came to our soft opening. You made time again today for the podcast. I mean, you're clearly busy and have a million things going on. I really appreciate you.
Well, Jacob, it's been great to get to know you and John over the years. You're both very industrious, very entrepreneurial. I would say the definition of entrepreneurial. And it's great to see. And I've never done a podcast. This is my first one. And as we were talking a little bit earlier, podcasts are replacing traditional media. So maybe we'll be doing a lot more of these things in the future.
I'd love it. You're natural at it, Tom. My last question for you. Looking back at this really cool journey you've been on, what advice would you offer to your 23-year-old self?
So it's hard to believe that I was 23 at one point. Unfortunately, I just turned 60, and my friends from high school and I were on a text chain, and all my teammates from basketball. And the other day, one of us said, I can't believe, how did this happen? How did we become 60? The years just fly by. So the one thing I would say, though, is enjoy the ride as you go, because you don't know where you're going to end up. And wherever you end up, you're not going to be there for very long. And so if you don't enjoy everything that's happening along the way, you will miss out on an awful lot. So that would be the one thing I would say. And I think I've done that. I think I've enjoyed the ride. Maybe I should have enjoyed it more. But that would be the advice I'd give somebody is enjoy the ride, because you don't want to miss out on all the things that life has to offer.
I love it. If you guys enjoyed this episode, please make sure to share it with a friend. You can find me on Instagram at Jacob O'Connor. The podcast is at Real Period Conversations. Tom, thank you for coming on.
Thank you, Jacob.